You have perhaps arrived here because something hollow gnaws at you, a persistent ache that follows you from morning until night, through crowded rooms and silent hours alike. That emptiness you feel is not a flaw in your character, nor is it evidence of your failure to live correctly. No, what you carry is far more ancient, far more significant than the modern mind dares to acknowledge. When Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the abyss that gazes back into us, he was not crafting poetic metaphor for the sacknosing a condition of beauty. He was diag the soul that most human beings will spend their entire lives fleeing from, medicating against, or desperately trying to fill with whatever substance, relationship, or achievement promises temporary relief. But here is what the philosopher understood that we have forgotten. Emptiness is not the enemy. It is the doorway. The emptiness you feel is not personal inadequacy. It is existential honesty. It is your psyche's refusal to accept the comfortable lies that keep most people sedated in their sleepwalking existence. When you feel that hollow ache, you are experiencing what Nietzsche called the death of God, not the literal demise of a deity, but the collapse of all the inherited meanings, values, and purposes that once gave life its apparent significance. Most people, when confronted with this void, immediately begin the frantic work of reconstruction. They seek new idols, new certainties, new systems of belief that will restore the illusion of solid ground beneath their feet. They throw themselves into careers, relationships, spiritual practices, political movements, anything that might silence the whisper of meaninglessness that threatens to overwhelm them. But this is precisely where they go astray. The emptiness you feel is not a problem to be solved. It is a space to be entered. It is the clearing in which something authentically your own can finally emerge. But to understand this, we must first examine why this void opens in the first place and why it feels so terrifyingly personal, when it is, in fact, the most universal human experience. Picture this. You are born into a world that presents itself as already complete. Your parents, your teachers, your society, they all speak with apparent certainty about what matters, what is true, what constitutes a life worth living. They hand you a map of reality that seems detailed and reliable. You follow this map for years, decades perhaps, until one day you look up and realize you are completely lost. The emptiness that follows this realization is not depression, though it may feel similar. It is not existential crisis, though the symptoms overlap. What you are experiencing is what Nietzsche termed the prerequisite for authentic existence. The moment when all borrowed meanings fall away and you stand naked before the fundamental question, who are you when no one is telling you who to be? This confrontation with emptiness reveals something that our achievement-obsessed, distraction-saturated culture desperately wants to hide. Most of what we call living is actually elaborate avoidance. We fill our schedules, our minds, our hearts with activities and relationships and pursuits that serve primarily to keep us from encountering the silence within ourselves. We become addicted to noise, not just auditory noise, but psychological noise, emotional noise, the constant chatter of a mind that fears what it might discover in stillness. But here is the paradox that Nietzsche understood and that we must learn to embrace. The very emptiness we flee from is the source of our greatest potential power. It is in the void that we discover our capacity to create meaning rather than simply inherit it. It is in the darkness that we learn to generate our own light. It is in the silence that we finally hear our own voice. Consider how most people respond to emptiness when it arises. They immediately reach for something to fill it. A relationship, a goal, a belief system, a substance, a distraction. They treat emptiness like a wound that must be bandaged, a hunger that must be fed, a problem that demands an immediate solution. But what if emptiness is not a deficit, but a gift? What if it is not absence, but presence? The presence of pure potential waiting to be actualized. The philosopher spoke of becoming who you are, but this becoming is impossible while you remain filled with what others have poured into you. Parents pour their unfulfilled dreams into their children. Society pours its expectations into its citizens. Religion pours its doctrines into its followers. Education pours its facts into its students. And slowly, gradually, the authentic self, the one who could create something genuinely new, drowns beneath layers of inherited programming. Emptiness, then, is not the problem. Emptiness is the solution. It is the great clearing away that must happen before anything authentic can emerge. But here is where most people falter. They mistake this clearing away for destruction, rather than recognizing it as preparation. They experience the dissolution of old certainties as catastrophe rather than liberation. This is why the confrontation with emptiness feels so threatening. It demands that we release our grip on all the identities, beliefs, and purposes that we have used to define ourselves. It asks us to stand in uncertainty without immediately grasping for new certainties. It requires that we develop what Nietzsche called the courage to be, not the courage to do or achieve or accomplish, but the deeper courage simply to exist without justification, without permission, without the approval of external authorities. But let us be precise about what this emptiness actually is, because there are many counterfeits that masquerade as authentic void. There is the emptiness of depression, which is characterized by numbness and withdrawal from life. There is the emptiness of nihilism, which concludes that nothing matters, and therefore nothing is worth pursuing. There is the emptiness of cynicism, which protects itself from disappointment by refusing to invest in anything meaningful. The emptiness that Nietzsche spoke of is different from all of these. It is not numbness, but heightened sensitivity. It is not withdrawal, but deeper engagement. It is not nihilism, but the precondition for creating your own values. It is not cynicism, but radical openness to what might be possible. This authentic emptiness is characterized by several distinct qualities that we must learn to recognize. First, it is accompanied not by despair, but by a strange kind of excitement, the excitement of standing at the edge of unexplored territory. Second, it generates not paralysis, but an increased sense of responsibility, the recognition that you are now accountable for creating meaning, rather than simply discovering it. Third, it produces not isolation, but a deeper connection to your own depths and, paradoxically, to others who have made the same journey. When you feel this authentic emptiness, you are not experiencing the absence of meaning, but the presence of infinite possibility. You are not confronting your limitations, but discovering your creative capacity. You are not facing your smallness, but encountering your potential for expansion beyond any boundaries that others have set for you. This is why the journey into emptiness cannot be bypassed or shortened. It is not a phase to get through, but a transformation to undergo. It is not a problem to solve, but a mystery to enter. And it is not something that happens to you once, but a practice that must be renewed again and again throughout your life. Most people, when they feel emptiness approaching, immediately begin what we might call the filling frenzy. They throw themselves into new projects, new relationships, new philosophies, new therapies, anything that promises to restore the sense of fullness they believe they have lost. But this frantic filling is precisely what prevents the deeper transformation that emptiness is trying to facilitate. The emptiness wants to teach you something that no amount of external acquisition can provide: the difference between being filled by others and filling yourself from your own wellspring. It wants to show you the distinction between borrowed meaning and self-created purpose. It wants to reveal the gap between living according to inherited scripts and writing your own story. But to receive these gifts, you must develop what seems like an impossible skill: the ability to remain empty without immediately filling the space. You must learn to sit with uncertainty without grasping for premature answers. You must cultivate the capacity to feel hollow without interpreting that hollowness as evidence of your inadequacy or failure. This requires what Nietzsche understood to be the most difficult of all human achievements: learning to love your fate, including the parts of your fate that feel like dissolution. When emptiness arrives, it is not arriving as punishment, but as invitation. It is not coming to destroy you, but to hollow you out so that something unprecedented can take root in the cleared space of your being. Yet here we encounter a profound resistance that lives in the very marrow of human psychology. We are creatures designed for meaning-making, pattern-seeking, storytelling. When the familiar patterns dissolve and the old stories no longer satisfy, every fiber of our being screams for immediate replacement. We experience the absence of meaning as a kind of psychological suffocation, as if we cannot draw breath in a world that has suddenly become unintelligible. But what if this suffocation is not pathology, but metamorphosis? What if the difficulty breathing is not because there is no air, but because you are developing new lungs? What if the disorientation is not because you have lost your way, but because you are being prepared to navigate territories that have no maps? The philosopher understood that human beings are meaning-creating animals, but he also recognized that most of what we call meaning is actually meaning inheritance. We take on the purposes, values, and significance that others have established and mistake this borrowed meaning for our own authentic relationship to existence. We live our lives according to scripts written by people we have never met, pursuing goals that were set by forces we do not understand, measuring our worth by standards we never consciously chose. Emptiness shatters this unconscious inheritance. It strips away the layers of borrowed significance until you stand face to face with the fundamental question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What do you actually value when no one is watching, no one is judging, no one is keeping score? What matters to you when the approval of others is not available as a guide? What would you pursue if there were no external rewards, no social recognition, no inherited shoulds and musts directing your choices? These questions cannot be answered from the comfortable distance of intellectual speculation. They require that you enter the emptiness and remain there long enough for something authentic to emerge from the depths. They demand that you develop what we might call existential courage, not the courage to face external dangers, but the courage to face the groundlessness of your own existence. This groundlessness is what terrifies most people about emptiness. We want solid foundations, reliable certainties, unchanging truths to build our lives upon. We want to know that our choices are correct, our beliefs are justified, our purposes are legitimate. But emptiness reveals that all foundations are ultimately provisional, all certainties are constructions, all truths are perspectives that we have chosen to inhabit. This revelation can feel like falling, and indeed, it is a kind of falling away from the illusion of solid ground into the recognition that you have always been suspended in mystery. But what Nietzsche discovered, and what you must discover for yourself, is that this falling can become flying. If you stop grasping for something to hold on to, and instead learn to move with the current of your own becoming. The emptiness that follows the collapse of inherited meaning is not the end of the story, but the beginning of your story. It is the moment when you stop being a character in someone else's narrative and begin authoring your own. But authorship, true authorship, requires that you first clear away everything that is not authentically yours. Every borrowed opinion, every inherited expectation, every unconscious assumption about how life should be lived. This clearing away is what the emptiness accomplishes, but only if you allow it to complete its work. Most people interrupt the process. They feel the emptiness beginning to hollow them out and immediately reach for whatever is closest at hand to stuff back into the void. They grab new beliefs, new identities, new purposes, often the opposite of what they previously held, and convince themselves that they have solved the problem of meaninglessness. But this grasping, this desperate reaching for replacement meaning, prevents the deeper transformation that emptiness is trying to facilitate. It keeps you cycling through different versions of the same fundamental pattern, looking outside yourself for the significance that can only be generated from within. It maintains you in a state of dependency on external sources of meaning, when what is needed is the development of your own meaning-creating capacity. The authentic response to emptiness is not to fill it, but to inhabit it, not to solve it, but to explore it, not to escape it, but to befriend it. This befriending requires a complete reversal of our usual relationship to discomfort. Instead of treating emptiness as evidence that something is wrong, you must learn to recognize it as evidence that something is finally becoming right. When you feel empty, you are not experiencing the absence of your true self. You are experiencing the presence of your true self without all the accumulated debris that has obscured it. You are feeling the weight of your own existence without the comfortable cushions of borrowed meaning to soften the impact. You are confronting your own freedom without the familiar constraints of inherited purpose to limit your choices. This confrontation with freedom is perhaps the most disorienting aspect of authentic emptiness. We are accustomed to living within boundaries set by others, parents, society, tradition, religion. These boundaries, even when they feel restrictive, provide a sense of structure and direction. They tell us what to want, how to behave, what to value. When emptiness dissolves these external constraints, we suddenly find ourselves in a space of radical freedom that can feel more terrifying than any prison. But this terror of freedom is also its gift. When you no longer have external authorities telling you what your life should mean, you discover your own authority to create meaning. When you no longer have inherited purposes directing your choices, you uncover your capacity to generate your own purposes. When you no longer have borrowed values guiding your decisions, you encounter your power to establish your own values. This power, this capacity, this authority, these are not things you acquire from emptiness. They are things you discover you have always possessed, but never exercised. Emptiness does not give you the ability to create meaning. It removes the obstacles that prevented you from recognizing that you are already a meaning-creating being. It does not provide you with authentic purpose. It clears away the inauthentic purposes that obscured your connection to what genuinely matters to you. The journey through emptiness, then, is not a journey towards something you lack, but a journey back to something you are. It is not about becoming someone new, but about uncovering who you have always been. Beneath the layers of social conditioning and inherited expectation, it is not about finding your true self, but about stopping the search long enough for your true self to emerge naturally from the stillness. But this emergence cannot be forced, cannot be rushed, cannot be controlled. It happens according to its own timing, its own logic, its own mysterious process. Your task is not to direct this emergence, but to create the conditions in which it can occur. And the primary condition is your willingness to remain empty without immediately filling the space with substitutes for authentic meaning. This willingness requires what we might call negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. It demands that you develop comfort with not knowing, ease with not having, peace with not being filled. It asks you to trust that something valuable can emerge from nothing, that something meaningful can arise from meaninglessness, that something authentic can grow from emptiness. This trust is perhaps the most radical act available to the human psyche, to trust emptiness itself as a creative force. But such trust runs counter to every survival instinct, every social teaching, every cultural message that has shaped your understanding of what it means to be alive. We are taught that fullness equals success, that constant activity equals purpose, that accumulated achievements equal worth. Emptiness in this framework can only be interpreted as failure. Yet Nietzsche saw through this collective delusion with startling clarity. He recognized that what we call fullness is often nothing more than spiritual hoarding, the desperate accumulation of experiences, relationships, beliefs, and identities designed to create the illusion of substantiality. We stuff ourselves with borrowed significance until we can no longer hear the voice of our own authentic nature beneath the noise of all we have consumed. The philosopher spoke of eternal recurrence, the idea that you would live your exact life again and again for eternity. But consider this question from a different angle. If you had to live with your current relationship to emptiness forever, would that be bearable? If you had to spend eternity running from the void within yourself, filling every moment with distraction and every silence with noise, would that constitute a life worth living? Most people, confronted honestly with this question, would recognize that their current strategy for dealing with emptiness is itself a form of imprisonment. They have become addicted to fullness in the same way others become addicted to substances, not because fullness brings genuine satisfaction, but because the alternative feels too terrifying to contemplate. They live in constant fear of the moments when the distractions fail, when the relationships disappoint, when the achievements feel hollow, when the void reasserts itself with undeniable presence. But what if these moments of reassertion are not failures of your coping mechanisms, but invitations to a deeper way of being? What if the void keeps returning? Not because you are inadequate at filling it, but because it has something essential to teach you that can only be learned through direct encounter? The teaching of emptiness is not delivered through words or concepts, but through lived experience. It cannot be understood intellectually because it addresses dimensions of existence that the analytical mind cannot grasp. You must feel your way into this understanding, must allow your entire being to be educated by the experience of standing in the space where all familiar supports have been removed. In this space, you begin to discover something that completely transforms your relationship to existence itself. You discover that you are not a vessel waiting to be filled, but a wellspring capable of generating its own contents. You realize that meaning is not something you find, but something you create. You understand that purpose is not something bestowed upon you from outside, but something that emerges from the depths of your own being when given sufficient space and time. This realization changes everything about how you navigate daily life. Instead of constantly scanning your environment for sources of significance, you begin to recognize your own capacity to imbue any situation with meaning. Instead of seeking relationships that will complete you, you start forming connections from a place of wholeness rather than need. Instead of pursuing goals that promise to fill your emptiness, you begin creating objectives that express your authentic nature. But this transformation is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing practice. The old patterns of meaning-seeking and void avoidance are deeply ingrained, carved into your neural pathways through years of repetition. They will reassert themselves again and again, particularly during times of stress, transition, or uncertainty. The difference is that you no longer mistake these patterns for ultimate truth. You recognize them as habits that can be observed, understood, and gradually transformed. The practice of befriending emptiness becomes a lifelong discipline, not unlike meditation or physical exercise. Some days you will feel naturally comfortable with uncertainty and groundlessness. Other days you will find yourself grasping desperately for any source of external validation or meaning. Both experiences are part of the process. Neither represents success or failure in any absolute sense. What matters is your growing capacity to recognize when you are fleeing from emptiness and when you are opening to it. What develops over time is your ability to catch yourself in the act of reaching for substitutes and to pause, breathe, and return to the direct experience of whatever void is present. What strengthens through practice is your trust that something valuable can emerge from this willingness to remain open to what feels like nothing. This nothing, however, is pregnant with possibility in ways that our language struggles to capture. It is not the nothing of mere absence, but the nothing of pure potential. The space that exists before creation begins, the silence that contains all possible sounds, the darkness that holds all colors and potential. When you learn to rest in this pregnant nothing, you tap into the same creative source that artists access when inspiration strikes, that inventors connect with when breakthrough solutions emerge, that lovers touch when they transcend the boundaries of separate selfhood. The emptiness that terrifies you is the same emptiness that mystics throughout history have recognized as the source of all authentic spiritual experience. It is the void that Zen masters point toward when they speak of no mind, the darkness that Christian contemplatives enter when they practice the via negativa, the groundlessness that indigenous shamans traverse when they journey into non-ordinary reality. But you need not become a mystic or a shaman to benefit from this teaching. The emptiness that visits you in your ordinary life, in moments of transition, loss, uncertainty, or simple quiet, carries the same transformative potential. It offers the same invitation to discover what lies beneath all your strategies for avoiding direct encounter with existence, as it actually is. The key is learning to distinguish between empty emptiness and full emptiness. Empty emptiness is characterized by despair, numbness, and the sense that life has no point. It feels flat, gray, and lifeless. Full emptiness, by contrast, feels alive with potential. It may be uncomfortable, even frightening, but it pulses with energy and possibility. It feels like standing at the edge of a vast ocean rather than staring into a dead well. When you encounter full emptiness, your task is not to eliminate the discomfort, but to breathe through it, not to immediately grasp for meaning, but to allow meaning to gestate in the space you have created, not to fill the silence, but to listen to what wants to emerge from the depths of that silence. This listening requires a quality of attention that most people have never developed, the ability to pay attention to nothing in particular while remaining completely present and alert. This paradoxical attention, focused yet open, concentrated yet relaxed, is the skill that allows you to work with emptiness rather than against it. When you fight emptiness, you strengthen it by giving it the solidity of an opponent. When you try to fill it, you miss the opportunity to discover what it actually contains. When you flee from it, you remain forever at its mercy. But when you turn toward emptiness with curiosity rather than fear, with openness rather than resistance, with patience rather than urgency, something remarkable begins to happen. The emptiness begins to reveal itself, not as your enemy, but as your teacher, not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be explored, not as evidence of your inadequacy, but as invitation to discover capacities you never knew you possessed. This discovery process cannot be rushed or forced. It operates according to organic timing that has nothing to do with your preferences or schedules. Sometimes insights emerge quickly. Sometimes they percolate for months or years before becoming conscious. Sometimes the teaching comes through dreams, sometimes through sudden understanding in the middle of ordinary activities, sometimes through the gradual shift in how you experience yourself and your world. What you can control is your willingness to remain open to whatever wants to emerge. What you can develop is your capacity to sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for false certainties. What you can practice is the art of being present to your own experience without needing to justify, explain, or fix whatever you find there. This presence to your own experience, particularly to the difficult or uncomfortable aspects of that experience, is what allows the deeper transformation to occur. When you stop abandoning yourself in moments of emptiness, when you stop betraying your own depths by immediately filling them with distractions, when you stop treating your void as evidence of personal failure. In those moments, you create the conditions in which something authentically your own can finally take root. The something that emerges from this process is not a thing you can name or describe in advance. It is not a belief system you can adopt or a philosophy you can study. It is not a goal you can pursue or an identity you can assume. It is something far more mysterious and far more valuable. It is the emergence of your own unique way of being in the world, your own authentic response to the mystery of existence, your own creative engagement with the fundamental questions that all human beings must face. This emergence happens not through thinking about emptiness, but through living with it. Not through understanding it conceptually, but through allowing it to work on you at levels deeper than conscious comprehension. Not through mastering it, but through surrendering to its transformative power, while maintaining your capacity to choose how you respond to what it reveals. The choice that faces you is ultimately simple, though not easy. You can spend your life running from the emptiness within yourself, or you can turn toward it and discover what it has been trying to teach you all along. You can continue filling every silence with noise and every pause with activity, or you can develop the courage to let some spaces remain open. You can keep seeking meaning outside yourself, or you can discover your own capacity to create meaning from the ground up. Nietzsche understood that this choice is not made once, but must be renewed again and again throughout your life. Each time emptiness returns, and it will return, you face the same fundamental decision: flee or turn toward, fill or explore, resist or welcome. Each time you choose to welcome what feels like nothing, you strengthen your capacity to generate something authentic from the depths of your own being. This is not a philosophy you can adopt, but a practice you must live. It requires not belief, but experimentation, not faith, but courage, not understanding, but willingness. The emptiness that haunts you is also the emptiness that can liberate you, but only if you stop treating it as your enemy and begin recognizing it as your teacher. The teaching never ends because life never stops presenting you with opportunities to choose between authentic emptiness and substitute fullness. Each choice you make either strengthens your capacity for genuine creation or reinforces your dependence on borrowed meaning. Each moment of willingness to remain empty creates space for something unprecedented to emerge. Each decision to turn toward the void, rather than away from it, brings you closer to discovering who you actually are when all the costumes have been removed and all the scripts have been set aside. The question then becomes not whether you will encounter emptiness again, for you certainly will, but whether you will have developed the inner musculature necessary to remain present when it arrives. Most people, when they feel the familiar hollow beginning to open within them, immediately activate what we might call their emergency response system. They reach for their phone, their work, their relationships, their substances, anything that promises to close the gap before they have to feel its full dimensions. But consider what happens in this moment of reaching. You abandon yourself precisely when you most need your own presence. You flee from the very experience that contains the seeds of your liberation. You treat your own depths as a crime scene to be avoided rather than sacred ground to be explored. And in doing so, you reinforce the unconscious belief that you cannot be trusted to remain with yourself when things become difficult. This self-abandonment is perhaps the most tragic aspect of our relationship with emptiness. We learn early that discomfort means danger, that uncertainty equals threat, that the absence of external stimulation signals some fundamental problem with our existence. These lessons, absorbed in childhood and reinforced throughout our lives, create a kind of allergic reaction to our own inner spaces. We develop elaborate early warning systems designed to detect the first signs of approaching emptiness so we can mobilize our defenses before it fully arrives. But what if these defenses are actually preventing the very transformation they claim to facilitate? What if your sophisticated strategies for avoiding emptiness are the precise mechanisms keeping you trapped in cycles of artificial meaning and borrowed purpose? What if the cure you have been seeking exists within the very condition you have been trying to eliminate? This reversal of perspective requires what Nietzsche would have recognized as a complete revaluation of values. Instead of viewing emptiness as pathology, you must learn to see it as diagnosis, a precise indication of where your authentic life wants to break through the accumulated layers of conditioning. Instead of treating it as emergency, you must recognize it as invitation, an opening into dimensions of yourself that remain inaccessible as long as you stay busy managing the surface of your existence. The philosopher spoke of amor fati, love of fate. But this love cannot be genuine while you remain at war with essential aspects of your experience. How can you claim to love your life while despising the very spaces where that life might actually begin? How can you embrace your destiny while running from the emptiness that clears the way for something unprecedented to emerge? True love of fate includes love of the void, love of the uncertain, love of the moments when all familiar supports dissolve and you stand naked before the mystery of your own existence. This love is not sentimental affection, but fierce acceptance, the kind of acceptance that recognizes emptiness not as punishment, but as preparation, not as ending, but as beginning, not as evidence of your failure, but as invitation to discover what lies beyond all your previous definitions of success. Such acceptance transforms your entire relationship to discomfort. Instead of immediately seeking relief from difficult feelings, you begin to develop what we might call existential stamina, the capacity to remain present with whatever arises without needing to fix, change, or escape it. This stamina is not built through willpower or positive thinking, but through repeated practice of staying with your own experience, even when that experience feels empty of meaning, purpose, or direction. Each time you choose to remain present with emptiness, rather than fleeing from it, you build what could be called your tolerance for mystery. This tolerance is essential because authentic living requires that you operate from a foundation of not knowing, rather than false certainty. It demands that you make decisions without guarantees, pursue goals without predetermined outcomes, love without assurance of reciprocation. Most people find this level of uncertainty unbearable. They would rather live according to someone else's plan than face the terrifying freedom of creating their own. They prefer the security of inherited meaning to the adventure of discovering what actually matters to them. They choose the familiar prison of other people's expectations over the unknown territory of their own authentic desires. But you cannot create anything genuinely new from a place of certainty. Innovation requires that you venture beyond the boundaries of what is already known. Authentic expression demands that you speak from places that have no established vocabulary. True intimacy asks that you reveal aspects of yourself that have never been shown to another person. All of these require that you develop comfort with not knowing what will happen when you step outside the familiar patterns that have governed your life. The emptiness that visits you is training you for precisely this kind of venture into the unknown. Each moment you spend with the void without immediately filling it strengthens your capacity to operate from uncertainty. Each experience of remaining present with meaninglessness increases your ability to create meaning from scratch. Each encounter with your own groundlessness develops your skill at moving through life without the false security of predetermined answers. This movement through uncertainty is not random wandering, but purposeful exploration. There is a difference between being lost and being willing to explore territory that has no established maps. When you are lost, you experience anxiety about not knowing where you are. When you are exploring, you experience excitement about discovering what lies beyond the familiar. The difference is not in the external circumstances, but in your internal relationship to not knowing. Emptiness teaches you to distinguish between these two modes of encountering the unknown. When you fight against the void, you experience it as being lost, disoriented, anxious, desperate to find your way back to familiar ground. When you open to the emptiness, you experience it as exploration, curious, alert, ready to discover what wants to emerge from the depths of uncertainty. This shift from fighting to opening is not something you accomplish once and then maintain forever. It is a choice you must make repeatedly, sometimes moment by moment, as you navigate the ongoing challenge of living authentically in a world that rewards conformity. The old patterns of meaning-seeking and void avoidance are deeply embedded in your nervous system. They will continue to activate automatically whenever you encounter uncertainty or discomfort. The difference is that you no longer have to be unconsciously controlled by these patterns. You can notice when they arise, acknowledge their presence without judgment, and then choose how to respond. Sometimes you will still reach for familiar distractions. This is part of being human. But gradually, you develop the capacity to catch yourself in the act of reaching and to pause long enough to consider whether filling the emptiness is actually what you want to do in this moment. This pause, this moment of conscious choice between old patterns and new possibilities, is where your freedom lives. It is the space in which you can choose to respond rather than react, to create rather than repeat, to express your authentic nature rather than perform inherited roles. But this space only opens when you have developed sufficient tolerance for the discomfort of not immediately knowing what to do. Most people collapse this space by rushing toward quick solutions, immediate gratifications, or familiar behaviors that promise to restore their sense of control. They cannot bear the few seconds of uncertainty that exist between stimulus and response, between question and answer, between emptiness and whatever wants to fill it. They treat this pause as intolerable delay rather than recognizing it as the birthplace of authentic action. But when you learn to inhabit this pause, when you develop the capacity to rest in the space between no longer and not yet, you discover something remarkable. This is where creativity lives. This is where genuine choice becomes possible. This is where you stop being a mechanical reactor to circumstances and begin functioning as a conscious creator of your own experience. The emptiness that terrifies most people is actually this creative pause extended in time. It is the space between old meanings that no longer satisfy and new meanings that have not yet emerged. It is the gap between inherited purposes that no longer inspire and authentic purposes that are still gestating. It is the silence between borrowed words and your own voice, finally finding what it wants to say. Learning to live in this extended pause requires tremendous courage because it means giving up the comfort of knowing who you are in favor of discovering who you might become. It means releasing your grip on familiar identities even when you have no guarantee that new ones will emerge to replace them. It means trusting the creative process even when that process feels like dissolution rather than construction. This trust is perhaps the most sophisticated psychological skill a human being can develop. It is not naive faith in positive outcomes, but mature acceptance of uncertainty as the price of authentic living. It is not blind optimism about the future, but clear-eyed willingness to engage with whatever emerges from the depths of your own being. It is not passive waiting for something to happen, but active participation in the mysterious process by which authentic selfhood comes into existence. The paradox is that this active participation often looks like doing nothing. When emptiness arises, your most creative response may be simply to remain present with it without immediately trying to make it into something else. When uncertainty appears, Your most intelligent choice may be to sit with the not knowing, rather than grasping for premature answers. When the familiar supports of meaning and purpose dissolve, your wisest action may be to allow the dissolution to complete itself, rather than frantically trying to reconstruct what has already outlived its usefulness. This capacity to do nothing in the face of emptiness runs counter to every message our culture sends about productivity, efficiency, and constant forward motion. We are taught that every moment must be utilized, every silence filled, every pause explained. The idea that sometimes the most productive thing you can do is remain completely still seems not just wasteful, but almost immoral in a society that equates activity with value. Yet it is precisely in these moments of apparent inactivity that the deepest transformation occurs. Just as a field must lie fallow to restore its fertility, your consciousness must periodically empty itself of accumulated content to make room for fresh growth. Just as a forest fire clears away undergrowth to allow new plants to take root, the emptiness that periodically sweeps through your inner landscape clears away psychological debris to create space for unprecedented forms of self-expression. But you must learn to recognize the difference between productive emptiness and merely vacant time. Productive emptiness is characterized by alert presence, conscious awareness, and willingness to encounter whatever arises. Vacant time is characterized by mental fog, unconscious distraction, and avoidance of direct experience. The external appearance may be identical. In both cases, you might be sitting quietly, apparently doing nothing, but the internal quality is completely different. When you inhabit emptiness productively, you feel simultaneously relaxed and energized, peaceful, yet alert, open to whatever wants to emerge without grasping for particular outcomes. There is a quality of listening in this state, not listening for sounds, but listening with your entire being for whatever wants to arise from the depths of consciousness. This listening is not passive waiting, but active receptivity, not mental laziness, but a different kind of mental activity altogether. This different kind of mental activity is what allows authentic insights to emerge. When your mind is busy trying to solve problems or achieve goals, it operates within established patterns of thinking. It recombines familiar elements in slightly new configurations, but rarely generates genuinely original perspectives. True creativity requires that you step outside these established patterns long enough for something unprecedented to arise. The emptiness that most people flee from is actually the prerequisite for this stepping outside. It is the state of consciousness in which your usual mental patterns temporarily suspend their operations, creating space for new forms of awareness to emerge. But this suspension can feel deeply uncomfortable because it means temporarily giving up the illusion of control that thinking provides. Most people would rather think ineffectively about their problems than stop thinking altogether, even when continued thinking is clearly not producing solutions. They prefer the familiar frustration of mental spinning to the unfamiliar territory of mental stillness. They choose the known discomfort of repetitive thoughts over the unknown possibility that exists in the space between thoughts. But it is precisely in this space between thoughts that wisdom arises. Not wisdom as accumulated knowledge or learned information, but wisdom as direct insight into the nature of your situation, your patterns, your authentic desires and capacities. This wisdom cannot be accessed through more thinking, because it exists at a deeper level than conceptual understanding. It can only be encountered through the kind of open awareness that becomes possible when you stop trying to figure everything out. The emptiness that visits you is an invitation to discover this deeper level of knowing. It is asking you to trust that intelligence exists beyond the chattering of your analytical mind. It is suggesting that solutions often emerge not through mental effort, but through mental spaciousness. It is pointing toward a way of being in the world that is guided not by predetermined plans, but by moment-to-moment responsiveness to what life is actually presenting. This responsiveness requires that you develop what we might call existential flexibility, the ability to change course when circumstances shift, to release expectations when reality proves different from your projections, to remain open to possibilities that your planning mind never considered. Such flexibility is impossible as long as you remain rigidly attached to filling every emptiness with familiar content. The practice then becomes learning to dance with emptiness rather than wrestling with it. Dancing requires that you move with your partner rather than against them, that you follow their lead while also contributing your own steps, that you remain responsive to shifts in rhythm and direction. When you dance with emptiness in this way, it begins to reveal its hidden intelligence, its subtle guidance, its capacity to lead you toward expressions of yourself that you never could have planned or predicted. This dance unfolds differently for each person because each person's authentic nature is unique. What emerges from your encounters with emptiness will not look like what emerges from anyone else's similar encounters. This is why there can be no universal formula for navigating the void, no step-by-step process that guarantees particular results. The emptiness that visits you is specifically calibrated to your particular constellation of gifts, wounds, and potentials. Your task is not to follow someone else's map through the territory of meaninglessness, but to develop your own capacity for navigation without maps. This capacity is built through repeated practice of remaining present with uncertainty, of breathing through discomfort without immediately seeking relief, of allowing difficult feelings to move through you without resistance or premature resolution. Each time you successfully navigate a period of emptiness without abandoning yourself, you strengthen what could be called your existential immune system, your ability to encounter challenging experiences without being overwhelmed by them. Each moment you choose presence over distraction, openness over defensiveness, curiosity over fear. You build the inner resources necessary for authentic living in an uncertain world. These resources are not built through comfort, but through conscious engagement with discomfort. They are not developed through success, but through willingness to fail and learn from failure. They are not accumulated through achievement, but through the gradual recognition that your worth is not dependent on external accomplishments, but on your capacity to remain present with whatever life brings. This recognition is perhaps the most revolutionary insight that emerges from sustained engagement with emptiness. When you stop looking outside yourself for validation, meaning, and purpose, you discover that these qualities can be generated from within. When you stop waiting for external circumstances to change before you can be happy, you find that happiness is not dependent on circumstances, but on your relationship to whatever circumstances arise. The emptiness that once terrified you begins to feel like home, not because it becomes comfortable, but because you develop the capacity to be comfortable with discomfort, certain of uncertainty, at peace with groundlessness. You realize that you have been seeking solid ground in a fundamentally fluid reality, permanent answers to questions that keep evolving, final solutions to the ongoing mystery of existence. This realization is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it reveals how much energy you have wasted trying to control what cannot be controlled. Liberating because it frees you to engage creatively with the constant flow of change rather than exhausting yourself in futile attempts to make that flow stop or slow down to your preferred pace. When you finally understand that emptiness is not your enemy, but your teacher, not your problem, but your portal, not evidence of your inadequacy, but invitation to discover your deepest capacities. In that moment, everything changes. Not because your circumstances become different, but because your relationship to whatever circumstances arise has been fundamentally transformed. You begin to move through life not as someone who must constantly defend against emptiness, but as someone who knows how to work with emptiness as a creative force. You start to recognize the early signs of approaching void, not with dread, but with interest, curious about what this particular encounter with nothingness might teach you. You develop the capacity to welcome uncertainty as an old friend who always arrives bearing gifts, even when those gifts are initially wrapped in forms you do not recognize. This welcoming of uncertainty, this befriending of emptiness, this embrace of the groundless ground of existence. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of saying yes to life. Not yes only to the pleasant parts, the meaningful moments, the times when everything makes sense, but yes to the whole catastrophe, including the parts that feel like dissolution, meaninglessness, and void. Such a yes is not spoken once, but must be renewed daily, sometimes hourly, as you navigate the ongoing challenge of remaining open to whatever wants to emerge from the depths of your being. Each renewal of this yes is an act of courage, a choice to trust the creative process, even when you cannot see where it is leading. A decision to remain present with your own experience, even when that experience includes encounters with the vast emptiness that underlies all form. The emptiness will continue to visit you. This is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of conscious existence. But your relationship to these visits can transform completely. Instead of experiencing them as intrusions to be repelled, you can learn to recognize them as invitations to be accepted. Instead of treating them as evidence of personal failure, you can understand them as opportunities for personal evolution. Instead of fleeing from them in terror, you can turn toward them with the curiosity of an explorer encountering uncharted territory. This transformation of your relationship to emptiness transforms everything else as well. Your relationships become less needy and more generous. Your work becomes less driven and more inspired. Your goals become less about filling holes in yourself and more about expressing what is already whole within you. Your entire life begins to flow from fullness rather than emptiness, from presence rather than absence, from the recognition that you are already complete rather than the belief that you are fundamentally lacking. But this recognition cannot be forced or manufactured through positive thinking or spiritual practice. It emerges naturally when you stop running from the very experiences that are trying to teach you that you are not what you think you are. It arises spontaneously when you finally allow the emptiness to do its work of clearing away everything that is not essentially you. The work is never finished because you are not a static entity, but a dynamic process, constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly encountering new forms of emptiness that call forth new expressions of your authentic nature. Each phase of life brings its own particular variety of void, its own specific invitation to discover previously unknown dimensions of yourself. What remains constant is not the content of your experience, but your capacity to remain present with whatever content arises. What develops over time is not the elimination of emptiness, but your skill at dancing with it, working with it, allowing it to serve its essential function in the ongoing creation of your authentic life. This is the deepest teaching that emptiness offers. You are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. You are not a void to be filled, but a creative force learning to express itself through the very experiences that once seemed to threaten your existence. You are not broken and in need of repair, but whole and in need of recognition. Recognition of the completeness that has been present all along, hidden beneath layers of conditioning that taught you to look everywhere except where you actually are. The recognition that you are already whole does not eliminate the experience of emptiness. It transforms your understanding of what emptiness actually is. When you no longer interpret the void as evidence of something missing, you begin to perceive it as evidence of something present that has not yet revealed itself. The darkness that once felt like absence begins to feel like presence in disguise, waiting for your consciousness to develop the capacity to recognize what has been there all along. This shift in perception is not intellectual understanding, but lived recognition. It happens not through thinking differently about emptiness, but through experiencing it differently, through allowing yourself to sink so deeply into the void that you encounter what lies at its very bottom. Most people never make this descent because they turn back at the first sign of discomfort, convinced that going deeper will only lead to greater suffering. But those who persist in their exploration discover something that completely reverses their understanding of what they thought they were fleeing from. At the bottom of the deepest emptiness lies not more emptiness, but a fullness so complete, so overwhelming, that it can only be approached through the gateway of apparent nothingness. This fullness is not filled with content, not with thoughts, feelings, sensations, or experiences, but filled with the very source from which all content emerges. It is the creative principle itself, the generative mystery that gives birth to all forms while remaining itself formless. When you finally encounter this source, you realize that emptiness and fullness are not opposites, but different faces of the same fundamental reality. The void that terrorized you was never actually empty. It was so full of potential that your ordinary consciousness could not detect its contents. Like a room so bright that it appears dark to eyes adjusted to dim light, the creative source appears empty to a mind accustomed to the relatively dim illumination of borrowed meaning and inherited purpose. This encounter with the source changes everything about how you understand yourself and your relationship to existence. You realize that you are not a separate entity, struggling to find meaning in an indifferent universe, but a temporary expression of the very creative principle that continuously brings new possibilities into being. You are not outside the mystery looking in. You are the mystery looking at itself through the unique lens of your individual perspective. This recognition dissolves the fundamental anxiety that drives most human behavior, the fear that you are alone, insignificant, and ultimately meaningless in the face of vast cosmic forces. When you understand that you are not separate from these forces, but are one of the ways these forces express themselves, the entire framework of scarcity and competition that governs ordinary consciousness begins to collapse. You no longer need to prove your worth or justify your existence because you realize that your very being is proof of the universe's creative intelligence. But this recognition brings with it a profound responsibility that many people find more challenging than the emptiness they were trying to escape. When you understand that you are an expression of the creative principle, you can no longer hide behind the excuse that you are powerless, that circumstances control you, that you are a victim of forces beyond your influence. You must acknowledge that you are continuously creating your experience through the choices you make about how to respond to whatever arises. This creative responsibility extends to every aspect of your existence. You are not just responsible for your actions, but for your interpretations, not just for your words, but for your silence, not just for what you do, but for who you choose to become in each moment. The emptiness that once seemed like a curse reveals itself as the space of pure creative potential, the laboratory in which you continuously experiment with new ways of being human. Most people recoil from this level of responsibility because it eliminates all the comfortable excuses that allow them to remain unconscious. It is easier to believe that you are trapped by circumstances, limited by your past, or controlled by other people than to acknowledge that you are continuously choosing how to respond to the raw material of existence. It is more comfortable to see yourself as a victim of meaninglessness than to recognize yourself as the author of whatever meaning your life contains. The philosopher understood that this recognition, this awakening to your own creative authority, is both the goal and the terror of authentic human development. It is what every person secretly yearns for and simultaneously fears more than anything else. To be truly free means to be truly responsible, and most people prefer the safety of imaginary chains to the uncertainty of genuine liberation. Yet this liberation is not optional if you wish to live authentically. The emptiness will continue to visit you until you finally understand what it is trying to teach you about your own nature. Each encounter with the void is an invitation to remember that you are not a passive receiver of predetermined meaning, but an active creator of whatever significance your life contains. Each experience of meaninglessness is a reminder that you have been looking in the wrong direction for the source of purpose and fulfillment. The direction you have been looking, outward toward other people, institutions, and circumstances for validation and meaning, is precisely backwards from where authentic purpose actually resides. The meaning you seek exists not in the external world, but in your unique way of engaging with that world. The purpose you hunger for is not waiting to be discovered, but waiting to be created through your willingness to express your authentic nature regardless of external approval or reward. This creative expression cannot be formulaic because authenticity, by definition, must be unprecedented. What emerges from your encounter with emptiness will be unlike anything that has emerged from anyone else's similar encounter. This is why there can be no instruction manual for navigating the void, no guaranteed method for transforming emptiness into meaning. The process is inherently experimental, requiring that you develop your capacity for improvisation rather than your skill at following predetermined scripts. The improvisation that authentic living requires is not random or chaotic, but emerges from deep listening to what wants to be born through your unique configuration of gifts, wounds, and circumstances. This listening happens not with your ears, but with your entire being, not through thinking, but through a kind of embodied attention that can detect the subtle movements of creative energy before they crystallize into specific forms. When you learn to listen in this way, you begin to sense the difference between authentic impulses that arise from your depths and inauthentic impulses that arise from conditioning, social pressure, or unconscious reaction to past trauma. Authentic impulses feel alive, energizing, and aligned with something deeper than personal preference. Inauthentic impulses feel compulsive, draining, and disconnected from your essential nature. The emptiness serves as a kind of purification process that helps you distinguish between these different types of impulses. When all the familiar sources of stimulation and distraction are removed, when the noise of social expectation and cultural programming quiets down, what remains are the impulses that emerge from your authentic core. These impulses may be subtle at first, barely perceptible whispers that require great stillness and attention to detect. But as you develop your capacity to remain present with emptiness without immediately filling it, these authentic impulses grow stronger and clearer. They begin to coalesce into what you might recognize as your genuine interests, your real values, your actual desires, rather than the desires you think you should have. They point toward activities, relationships, and forms of expression that feel truly nourishing rather than merely stimulating. This discovery of what actually nourishes you, as opposed to what merely distracts you, is one of the most valuable gifts that sustained engagement with emptiness provides. Most people are so accustomed to filling their time with activities that provide temporary relief from discomfort that they never discover what kinds of engagement actually increase their sense of vitality and aliveness. They mistake stimulation for nourishment, excitement for fulfillment, busyness for purposeful activity. The process of distinguishing between nourishment and mere stimulation requires that you develop what could be called discernment of energy, the ability to notice how different activities, relationships, and environments affect your overall sense of well-being. Some experiences leave you feeling more energized and alive afterward, while others leave you feeling depleted despite being superficially enjoyable. Some relationships inspire you to become more yourself, while others require that you diminish aspects of your authentic nature to maintain connection. This energetic discernment cannot be developed through analysis or comparison, but only through direct experience of how different choices affect your inner state. The emptiness that periodically clears away all your usual activities and distractions provides the perfect laboratory for conducting these experiments. When you are not automatically filling every moment with habitual behaviors, you have the opportunity to notice what you actually want to do, rather than what you think you should do. What you discover through these experiments is often surprising, because your authentic desires may be quite different from what your conditioned mind expects. You may find that activities you thought you enjoyed actually drain your energy, while activities you never considered turn out to be deeply fulfilling. You may discover that relationships you maintained out of habit or obligation actually prevent you from accessing your authentic nature, while solitude you previously avoided turns out to be profoundly nourishing. These discoveries can be disorienting because they may require significant changes in how you structure your life, spend your time, and relate to other people. It can be challenging to acknowledge that activities you have built your identity around no longer serve your authentic development, or that relationships you have invested years in cultivating actually diminish rather than enhance your sense of aliveness. But the alternative to making these difficult adjustments is to continue living a life that feels increasingly empty, despite being filled with activities and relationships. The emptiness that visits you is not punishing you for living inauthentically. It is showing you the cost of continuing to ignore what your depths are trying to tell you about what would actually constitute a fulfilling existence. The cost of ignoring these deeper promptings is not just personal dissatisfaction, but a kind of existential exhaustion that comes from continuously swimming against the current of your own nature. When you spend your energy maintaining a lifestyle that does not align with your authentic interests and values, you create an internal friction that depletes your vitality even when external circumstances appear successful. The emptiness will return, dear soul, because it is not your enemy, but your most faithful teacher. Each time it arrives, you will face the same sacred choice: to flee toward the familiar distractions, or to turn inward with the courage of one who has finally understood that what you seek has never been absent. You are not broken, waiting to be fixed. You are whole, waiting to be recognized. The void you fear is the very space where your authentic life is born.